Então, dando continuidade à parte da tarde do nosso colóquio, primeiro colóquio sobre Pervivência Clássica, interfaces entre tradução e recepção dos clássicos greco-latinos, nós vamos montar essa mesa com o professor Ioannis Petropoulos, da Democritean University of Thrace and Center for Hellenic Studies in Greece, da Universidade de Harvard. Vocês têm aí o título e o resumo da palestra dele. O título é The Reception of Pagan Wisdom from St. Basil, from Caesarea to the Franciscan Friars of Salvador, Bahia. I would like to thank you, Professor Petropoulos, for being here with us, sharing his ideas on this topic. Σας παρακαλούμε πολύ. Eu passo a palavra. The word is yours.
Senhoras e senhores, queria agradecer ao Centro de Humanidades de UFC, e especialmente ao professor De Brosi, pelo convite ao colóquio. Embora tenha dado muitas palestras em várias universidades brasileiras, é a primeira vez que participo de um colóquio nesse país. Cada vez admiro verdadeiramente o dinamismo, a dedicação e o espírito inovador de meus colegas e seus estudantes na área das humanidades em Brasil. É um privilégio eu ter a ocasião para um intercâmbio com vocês. E acho que o futuro dos estudos clássicos consiste na abordagem interdisciplinária. A propósito de nosso tema, a tradução, peço desculpa por não ter traduzido minha fala em sua belíssima língua, mas seria preferível se eu falasse em inglês. Aliás, receio que eu erre o caminho. Antes de começar, queria acrescentar que minha palestra é uma experimentação atrevida, na medida que não sou historiador de arte, menos perito na época barroca. Mas não pude resistir à tentação de falar sobre o convento de São Francisco em Salvador, Bahia. Quando o visitei há 3 anos, lembrei que as letras clássicas, sobretudo os gregos clássicos, não teriam sobrevivido sem o cuidado e a intervenção de São Basílio, na metade do século IV. Graças ao gosto literário rafinado dele e de alguns outros intelectuais da Igreja no Oeste, os textos do Homero não foram destruídos, como recentemente uma parte grande da cidade antiga de Palmira foi destruída. Veremos então como Basílio recebeu, liu, o Homero e outros autores pagãos, como ele traduziu Homero em termos da cultura que emergia. Addressed to his adolescent nephews and nieces, St. Basil's homily on how to read the Greek classics is a good case study of the reception of the canonical literary curriculum in the early Christian world. Because this highly popular text was translated into Syriac in the 5th century, into medieval Arabic, and around 1400 into Latin by Leonardo Bruni, and subsequently into Italian twice, it contributed to the reception of the Greek authors, not only in the Christian East, but also in Western Europe during the Renaissance and beyond the Renaissance. I would dare say that this foundational text had an indirect repercussion in 18th century Brazil. This possibility will be raised in the second part of my paper. Drawing on the literary critic Stanley Fish, I state my fundamental thesis. St. Basil belonged to an interpretive community of educated readers. In common with other members, he had internalized the same competence and interpretive strategies enshrined in academic institutions of his day. His insistence that only texts that conduce to character formation should be taught can be traced to Plato's strictures in the Republic on the teaching of Homer, Hesiod, and other poets, and more generally to the educational theory of late antiquity. This church father, living as he did in a culture that was becoming increasingly hybridized, engaged in his essay in a dialogue in order to show the relevance, indeed the necessity, of what was essentially the syllabus of the trivium to the receiving context of his Christian addressees. Starting in chapters 2 and 3, Basil takes stock of nothing less than, in Lorna Hardwick's phrase, I quote, the shifting balance between commonalities and differences, end of quote, discernible in the two cultures. The classical curriculum, he says, is practically a progymnasia, a preliminary training, progymnazometha, a preliminary training for the eventual apprehension of the dianoia, of the hiera kai aporita pedurmata, the Holy Scriptures, you might say, the hieroi logoi. The broad similarities between Christian and pagan authors make the latter suitable stepping stones to partaking of the Christian mysteries and spiritual life in general. Pagan literature has an affinity, what Basil calls ekeotes, to oikoion, to Christian teachings, to the degree that these extramural authors express an affiliation with the truth, which Basil calls syngenes te aletheia. And he calls everything that is not Christian writing and tradition exothen. We would say extramuros, or he would also say thurathen, away from the doors of the church. The ancient Greek classics, the backbone of rhetorical education, indeed were, in Basil's scheme, the first rung on the ladder to spiritual education. They introduced young Christians to a world of, admittedly, mere Platonic shadows and reflections, as he puts it in chapter 2. But if pursued with success, they qualified graduates to study the sublime dogma of the new faith. Basil was not alone in treating the pagan classics as a propaideia, for such was the teaching of Clement of Alexandria, of Origen, and of the 4th century fathers, as Antonio Garcia notes, adding that under this scheme, the fathers hoped that pagan paideia, and I quote, might eventually converge with Christianity. In terms of reception theory, the Church Father is doing two things in chapters 2 and 3. He is, first, establishing correspondences between the two cultures, but also foreignizing the pagan one. That is, stressing for the moment the difference between the source and its reception. Second, Basil anticipates that through his essay in cross-cultural reading, his addressees will gain the critical distance to perceive the superiority of their own receiving culture. And I've noted a few of my key ideas, or Basil's key phrases, on the handout. So the phrase he uses is katamathein to diaphoron es bebaiosin to beltionos. And I apologize for not using diacritics. So one has to katamathein, learn extremely well, à fond, to the difference and between Christianity and paganism. And that once you realize the difference, you can realize the superiority to beltion of paganism. Tellingly close correspondences between pagan and Christian concepts, moral concepts, narrow the margin of difference in the end, as he will argue in chapter 7, and demonstrate at length in chapter 9. Moses and Daniel are held up as fine examples of preliminary training in alien wisdom, for it equipped them for divine revelation. If Moses and Daniel profited by Egyptian and Chaldean wisdom per se, respectively, so also can young Christian students, provided they are guided in their choice of authors. Chapter 4 treats of poets and prose writers, and particularly the dangers of the literary portrayal of wicked deeds and the predilection of authors for wicked words. As he puts it, hotan de epimoxerus andras elthosi te memese. And also he uses the phrase, he prostus faulus ton logon synathia. So many poets, and especially prose writers, have a synathia, a penchant, you might say, a proclivity for fauloi, logoi, wicked words, or useless, bad words, evil words. Anyway, turning to poetry, Basil brings out the fact that certain poems have stylistic grace, but are corrupting. He demonstrates the spiritually fatal attraction of such poems by citing Odysseus' notorious encounter with the sirens. The churchman enjoins his addressees, and I quote, to stop up your ears no less than Odysseus did when he avoided the songs of the sirens. Stop up your ears, plug your ears. End of quote. This exemplum is also invoked by Clement of Alexandria, who, however, urges that Christians should react to pagan education like the discerning, inquisitive Odysseus when he chose to listen to the singing sirens rather than recoil fearfully from it. A Christian, if strong in his faith, should feel free to appreciate the rhythms and melodies of the sirens, which stand for pagan literature taught in school. To turn a deaf ear to literary education is to demonstrate the uncouthness, agroikia, and sheer ignorance, amathia, of Odysseus' crew. A little later than Clement, Plutarch uses the very same allusion to the sirens to deliver the lesson, don't plug the ears of the young, and don't let them sail away from poetry. No, no, no. Encourage them to indulge their intellectual curiosity. Just fasten them to the mast of upright reason and guide them in reading all this enchanting, if often deceitful material. Basil preaches the opposite to his young audience. Plug your ears and sail away, making no distinction between the behavior of Odysseus and that of his crew. He is admonishing specifically against the perils of poetry that represents wicked actions of wicked persons, fauloi, people. From the vantage point of reception theory, his second-hand allusion to Homer on the one side and Clemens and Plutarch's use of the same motif on the other are all equivalents in terms of reception theory, inasmuch as the same image, and I quote now Hardwick, the same image fulfills an analogous role in source and reception, but is not necessarily identical in form or content. St. Basil's employment of the siren episode is simultaneously a straightforward appropriation defined by Hardwick as, I quote, taking an ancient image or text and using it to sanction subsequent ideas or practices, end of quote. More than that, Plutarch, Clement, and Basil use to rhetorical advantage one of the salient elements of the original text, namely the fact that the siren's song represents a fatal variant of heroic song. A number of exegetical scholia regarded the binding of Odysseus to the mast as an edifying example of intellectual curiosity and self-control, enkrateia, in the face of hedone, pleasure. Plutarch and Clement are in tune with this laudatory strand of interpretation. St. Basil is, by contrast, closer to the censorious, the negative strand of the scholia that interpreted the hero's subsequent request to be unbound as the defeat of self-control by pleasure. The churchman's strictures in the first half of chapter 4 can be summed up in this way. Just as there are recessive, bad types of heroic song, as Homer himself seems to imply, so also are there poisonous variants of pagan poetry as a whole. These are the poems that portray lowly conduct and language. The sweet honey of poetry may, he warns, turn out to be poison. In this metaphor, implying that poetry is a medicine dispensed in a cup coated with honey, he is relying on Plato's laws. The arguments of chapter 4, which I cannot go into, show that Basil's interpretive strategy of methexis, participation in pagan literature, is oriented principally towards content and less towards style. The content for which literature should be exploited consists in, I quote Basil, whatever is beneficial to the soul. Compare, for instance, the phrase estitina kai ophelean ap auton logon estein psukein apothestai, which is equated with whatever is akin to truth. The simile of the prudent discriminating bee, abelia, that derives honey from a blossom whilst others only attend to its fragrance or colour, brings home Basil's moralizing interpretive strategy. The church father is appropriating a simile, he's pressing it into service, and the simile is a cliche of classical vintage that pseudo-Plutarch also used. One's response as a reader, he concedes, may involve paying attention to the pleasing surface attributes of pagan texts. Style is a superficial attribute, much as the fragrance or color of a flower, but it is the right content that yields Ophelia benefit, much as a flower from deep within rewards a bee with its honey. In chapter 5, the church father turns to Homer and to virtue, arete, in the more general sense of agatus enai. Homer's entire work, his entire oeuvre, Basil says, with the exception of certain unspecified subsidiary episodes, he calls them parerga, his entire work consists in pure praise of arete. And here I should like to quote in its entirety, number 2, item 2 on the handout. I haven't the Greek, but that is not really essential. Furthermore, as I have heard from some man formidable in his expertise in the dianoia, the meaning of the poet, all of Homer's poetry is praise of virtue, arete, and everything in him, his poetry, except whatever may be incidental, the parerga, leads in this direction, not least in the verses in which he has portrayed the Cephalenian general, i.e. Odysseus, as a naked survivor. First, he has portrayed him by his mere apparition to be inspiring respect in the princess, far from incurring shame when he was seen naked, since he, Homer, portrayed him adorned in virtue instead of clothes. Afterwards, he portrayed him to have been considered by the other Phaeacians as worthy to such a degree that, dismissing the luxury, the trophée in which they lived, one and all they eyed him admiringly and envied him, and no Phaeacian of that time might have more wished for anything else than to have been Odysseus, indeed, as a survivor from a shipwreck. For in these verses, the exegete, we don't know who this mysterious man is, or mystery man, but in these verses, the exegete of the poet's dianoia was asserting that Homer practically shouted in saying, "O human beings, you must cultivate virtue. This swims away together with the castaway, and will show him, on arriving naked on dry land, to be more honorable than the blissful Phaeacians. For indeed, this holds true. The other possessions do not belong more to their owners than to whomever may chance to possess these, for they shift from here to there exactly as in a game of dice. Only virtue among all possessions is inalienable, remaining the same in both life and death." What has Basil done here? He's reading, he actually reads 2 episodes back to back, one from book 6, the other from book 7. He expounds a moral allegory, as Donald Russell classifies the passage, a strategy under which the reader supposedly does not import moral messages into the text, no, but rather uncovers, he excavates the messages, the dianoia, that Homer himself intended but disguised. Basil justifies the use of this method of reading the poet by invoking the authority of some, as I said, mysterious, unnamed contemporary exegete, or perhaps he's not a contemporary. It is likely that Basil was echoing rather loosely either an exegetical cliché or possibly Antisthenes, the cynic, Socrates' pupil and the purported forerunner of the cynics, as I shall argue in the published version of this paper. By late antiquity, the view that Homer taught virtue in general was a philosophically inspired commonplace amply attested in the Iliad's Scholia. It encouraged moral allegoresis of Homer. Plutarch, in his treatise, How to Study Poetry, dealt with the same episode from the Odyssey, possibly because it was popular, especially amongst adolescent female students. He warns that this is a tricky passage and that the teacher must be prepared to explain or explain away the maiden's attraction to Odysseus. Plutarch, being a bit of a prude, doesn't even mention the hero's nakedness. So the teacher must be careful. He must sanitize the passage according to Plutarch. Basil, though equally keen to absolve Nausicaa of the accusation of prurience, waxes rapturous about the scene because he detects an ethical message in it. In his hermeneutic, the shipwrecked hero adumbrates the cynic model of a man, the cynic model of the man, a sage, really, a beggar sage, who has lost all his material possessions, yet preserves his integrity. Stripped of his clothing, Odysseus is clad in virtue, which covers up his nakedness. Basil's princess, Nausicaa, is not terrified by the sight of the animal-like man and his sexuality. She can only respect him. Subsequently dressed in real clothes, the newcomer impresses the Phaeacians with his virtue, which they come to consider more enviable than their life of luxury. The very sight of the stranger nearly converts the Phaeacians to cynic autarkia, or autarkeia, reacting as Alexander the Great did when he met Diogenes the cynic outside Corinth. I quote, "No Phaeacian of that time might have more wished for anything else than to have been Odysseus," as Basil puts it. As Diogenes Laertius records of the famous encounter, I quote, "They say that Alexander in turn said, 'Had I not been Alexander, I should have wanted to be Diogenes.'" Basil's interpretation of the Nausicaa episode has airbrushed the undertones of anti-heroic humor, nuptial language, and, as noted, eroticism. He has, in a sense, retranslated Homer. His interpretation of Odysseys 6 and 7 is, in effect, an allegory about the reception of pagan culture, the message being, strip this culture bare of its fine clothing, focus on its espousal, on its advocacy of moral excellence. The whole of chapter 5 is devoted to arete, in the sense of moral excellence, most probably of the cynic kind. Thus, Basil paraphrases, apparently from memory, Prodicus's famous allegory about Heracles' choice of virtue over vice. Remember, vice in this allegory figures as a modest virgin, vice as a sexy femme fatale with a lot of makeup. The story was recorded in Xenophon, Memorabilia 2, and other sources, perhaps cynic ones, my question, now no longer extant. Basil differs from Xenophon in one detail. He notes tellingly that the supreme reward for Heracles' unlimited sweat and exertions and dangers, and I'm quoting Basil, was deification, theon genesthai, a very important phrase to theology, certainly Orthodox theology, but borrowed in the ultimate analysis from Plato, I think, homoiosis theo. But this is not remarkable that Heracles, according to Basil, should become a god, because apotheosis was featured in Cynic and other versions of the story that Basil may have known. But as I said, Xenophon does not mention this. Chapters 6 through 8 argue that pagan prose writers, too, praise virtue and so offer lessons in virtue. So poetry, but also prose can be a source of instruction in virtue. Chapter 9, the homily's longest section, interweaves ascetic texts, or tenets, drawn from pagan moral thought, especially Platonic and Cynic, in a veritable essay on the practice of arete. The net result is a translation of pagan precepts into terms entirely understandable to Christians. The moral virtue taught by the classics is helpful to being good, agathos enai, or agathon enai. But does it have metaphysical, spiritual implications? Is it rewarded by God? In chapter 10, the homily's conclusion, Basil will touch upon this question, and in so doing, he will foreignize pagan arete, citing a story, an anecdote about Bias of Praene, one of the 7 sages. The church father schematically sets forth the difference between pagan or secular virtue and its Christian counterpart. The former provides, or merely provides, travel supplies, ephodion, as it were, for the duration of life in the here and now, whereas the other kind provides supplies in prospect of long and ageless eternity, aion. Basil leaves matters at that. He might have said, like other contemporary and later church fathers, that the virtue of pagan society was little more than natural virtue and mere ethical propriety. But his genuine sympathy with Greek learning and consideration of the youth of his addressees stopped him drawing too stark or detailed a theological contrast between the two kinds of virtue. Well, what have we been waiting for? I suppose the second part of my paper, which is going to be much briefer. Famously, Basil does not advocate censorship in his homily. He defends the critical reading of literature. His advice is paroran, diakrinein, hyperbainein, skip over, overlook. But he doesn't say hide, burn, destroy. Paroran, look the other way. And as noted, he draws examples from pagan high literature, such as Homer and Plato, besides more subliterary forms such as ancient anecdotes and creae. The wisdom of the pagans is available to the Christians, he urges, and can be used by them for spiritual purposes, just as Moses was trained in the wisdom of the Egyptians before he saw God. By the year 1400 AD, when the homily was translated into Latin, the Renaissance was about to begin. This homily by one of the Ur-fathers of the Church, now in translation, will have confirmed the medieval canonization of Horace as a school text, which canonization dated from the 11th century and probably earlier, and definitively encouraged the humanist classicizing vogue exemplified by, say, Ignatius Loyola and Erasmus in the 16th century. Horace, whom I just mentioned, and other classical authors were broken into short passages and excerpted in educational florilegia in the Middle Ages. In the Renaissance, these collections included Greek authors in Latin translation. Known as the Librae Locorum, these school books grouped sententiae, proverbs, and anecdotes under rubrics or mottos. Horace was a favorite, an all-time favorite, because he had long been regarded as ethicus. Presumably his Stoic strain was congenial to educators and churchmen alike. By the late 15th century, these collections of commonplaces had achieved their standard form, and their wide readership, which included European princelings, continued well into the 18th century. This brings me to my final topic, which concerns the reception and translation of the Latin classics in Pelourinho in Salvador in the mid-18th century. This case of reception is not, as far as I can see, due to the direct influence of Basil's homily, but it illustrates literally the Christian preoccupation with the value of pagan wisdom. I'm referring to 37 of the 56 decorative tiles, the azulejos, in the cloisters, the claustro of the monastery of San Francisco. Painted by an unknown Portuguese artist in Lisbon or Delft, the Netherlands, most of the images are modeled on gravure by the Flemish artist Otto van Veen, Rubens' teacher. Van Veen lived from 1555 to 1629, and like other Flemish artists, the so-called Flamingi, spent many years in Rome. In 1607 in Antwerp, he published a book entitled Quintae Horati Flaci Emblemata, which contains, for the first time, this is a big innovation, on the one page, the verso, texts by Horace and other Latin authors, and on the other, the recto, elaborate allegorical engravings, or emblemata. The images are inspired by Greco-Roman mythology. Now, the anonymous tile painter, the painter of the azulejos, in fact had access to Van Veen's images and texts via a Spanish book published anonymously in Madrid in 1648 and entitled Teatro Moral de la Vida Humana y de toda la Filosofía de los Antiguos y Modernos. In his choice of Horace as the almost exclusive source of his themosophic Stoic adages, Van Veen was probably influenced by his contemporary, the Bishop of Antwerp, Lavinus Torrentius, a leading Horace scholar and editor. What is more, education in the southern Netherlands was run by the Jesuits, who, in spite of their discreet censorship of pagan authors, accepted Horace lock, stock, and barrel as the moral text to be excerpted. The Jesuits' principle of matching images and sensory stimuli to abstractions and their pioneering of visual aids in the classroom must have appealed to Van Veen. The artist, in fact, stated in the preface of his book that emblemata, being a visual medium, are more stimulating and hence more edifying than the textual or oral medium of quotation. Because Van Veen's target group seems to have been the children of the southern Netherlandish nobility, his book can also be assigned to the genre of instruction of a gentleman or mirror of princes. In this respect, his book parallels St. Basil's essay, which ostensibly was also addressed to pupils and students. The brief texts in the cloisters of San Francisco are inscribed at the apex of each tile. So could I please have the first one? Some are not quotes at all, but rather mottos or headings, typical of the Librae Locorum.
This one or the other?
Is it concursa? Yes.
Yes. No, in concursa is this one.
Ah, yes, could we start with that one? Because of constraints of time, I can only take a quick and very amateurish look at 2 of the 10 emblems concerned with virtue. All 10 emblems are based ultimately on Van Veen. I shall first cite the texts and then examine the emblems. The book opens with the motto, Virtus in concursa, unshaken virtue, coined by Van Veen and diffusely inspired by Horace, Odes 3, Book 3, 2, one of the 3 Latin texts which he quotes, and it should be on your handout, Virtus repulsae, niscae sordidai, and so forth. True virtue never knows dirty defeat. Her robes she keeps unsullied still, nor takes nor quits her curule seat to please a people's veering will. In ancient Stoic thought, virtue was available to everyone, regardless of class. Its sole possession guaranteed happiness in the face of unstable fortune. By quoting the Horace passage above, Van Veen, by contrast, implies that real virtue is proper to aristocrats and not the fickle masses. A few words about the azulejo depiction, which is closely modeled on Van Veen's emblem. Virtue, and I hope you can make out the details, virtue in her traditional military outfit is framed by radiant sunlight and clouds, and 6 putti. She triumphantly tramples fortune. Objects associated with fortune are scattered at her feet in the foreground. As one specialist observes, and I quote, "The composition as a whole is reminiscent of Madonna's in a mandorla, because Mary, who's Mary, surrounded by angels, tramples the serpent." So it's a religious motif, ultimately, end of quote. By means of 6 putti, Van Veen has innovatively subdivided virtue into 6 attributes, you might call them sub-virtues, 4 of which are actually the 4 cardinal Platonic virtues, also accepted by the Catholic Church. We noticed 1, piety, pietas, the putto in the upper left corner, I hope it's upper left, is it? Embracing a sacred fire. This pietas was not a cardinal virtue in Plato's scheme, but was considered by Plato to be a form of justice, and justice is a cardinal virtue, and was certainly a crucial element of Roman imperial ideology and the ideology of the state and nobility in the West, as also in Byzantium. Second, justice, a cardinal virtue, as I said, the putto in the upper right holding the scales. Third, prudence, in Greek, phroneses, another cardinal virtue, the putto in the left carrying a mirror. 4, fortitude, Andrea, a Platonic virtue, the putto in the right supporting a column. 5, magnanimity. This is Aristotle's megalopsycheia, greatness of soul. This here is allegorized by the putto with the lion. It should be on the left. This quality, megalopsycheia, which could lend itself to pride and even vanity and was the opposite of humility, was deprecated by St. Thomas Aquinas. But already in Aristotle, it is allied with aristocratic conduct, and this prestigious association earned it a place in courtesy books of the 16th century. Van Veen, thus again, is promoting courtly aristocratic ideals. Finally, temperance, in Greek, sophrosune, the 4th cardinal virtue, is represented by the putto with a bridle. That is the bottom right. Now, let's go to the next, please, dear colleague, the next motto. The motto, virtus in actione consistit, crowns another emblem in the cloisters in San Francisco. Both the motto and the accompanying emblem derive from Van Veen. The sentence is an abbreviated version of Cicero de Officiis, and I quote, virtutis enim laus omnis in actione consistit. In other words, knowledge, the contemplative life, the life of meditation, is nothing unless put into practice in public life. This view is related to Aristotle's idea in the Nicomachean Ethics that virtue can only be achieved through practice. So you must practice what you preach and what you think about or meditate on. These notions had an especial resonance for aristocrats who championed a life of action. Now, the emblem itself shows sloth, laziness, idleness, a man asleep in a chamber tomb surmounted by wild vegetation. An ass, a donkey, proverbially lazy and lustful in ancient tradition, lies at his side. Virtue, a woman, sleeps in the adjoining room. At the left, a poet, pen and scroll in hand, is peering into the chamber in search of glorious deeds for immortalization. Alas, he remains unemployed because hidden virtue is as good as no virtue at all. In conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, how the padres in the cloisters of the monastery read, in particular, the prescriptive mottos about virtue as they walked past them every day is an intriguing question. Would they have been attuned to the elitist undercurrent of the ultimate source text, Van Veen's book of Horatian emblemata? Would they have Christianized these and other sententiae about virtue? St. Basil, we saw, approached pagan literature as a tableau of instances of secular virtue that prepared young and old alike for higher mysteries. It may be the case that the padres in 18th century Bahia read the azulejos with their mottos and images as preliminary exercises in worldly virtue. Perhaps they even went several steps, spiritual steps ahead, and, as it were, translated these texts into Christian terms. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your learned lecture on the topic. Então passamos agora à plateia. Se alguém tiver alguma pergunta, algum comentário. Bet is from Bahia.
Yes, I know. Yes, I should like to return to revisit the cloisters, and I shall understand better what it's all about, having read a bit about it.
I'm taking invitations too.
Thank you so much. I don't know if may I speak Portuguese or do you prefer like English?
Inglês ou
Make your
português?
comments?
Inglês ou português devagar?
Ok, português devagar.
Por favor.
Okay. Os pais pré-nicênicos, basicamente nos escritos dos 12 de Daquê, a Epístola de Barnabé, percebe-se uma tentativa da igreja de se distanciar do judaísmo como religião. Então, quando chegamos já no terceiro século, já percebe-se uma distância muito grande do judaísmo, mas uma aproximação que abraça quase que em sua inteireza os filósofos, especialmente Platão e Aristóteles, especialmente pensando em Orígenes. Isso seria a razão, Basílio e de outros, a razão deles buscarem essa virtude ética, mesmo secular, mundana, dentro desses filósofos, não seria uma forma de substituir, na sua perspectiva, a necessidade daquela vida prática também judaica que eles estavam. A igreja queria a todo custo não ser confundida mais com o judaísmo. Isso começa já first century, and then we have the Epistle of Barnabas too. But basically, the Epistle of Barnabas we can see him a little bit aggressive, speaking against all the Jewish Sabbath, and he basically wants to get rid of the any kind of relationship with the church. Would that be a possible explanation to this abandonment of this Jewish religious practice into basically to embrace ethics that involves pretty much this pagan secular way of thinking? Would you see something related?
No, at least in Basil's homily, I don't think he's trying to get away from Judaism. Okay. In fact, he interweaves allusions to the Old Testament and to the New Testament, but what is interesting is that he doesn't quote either the New Testament or the Old Testament outright. He had a good chance when he talked about virtue and Heracles being tempted by virtue and vice and having to take the straight and narrow path. He could have cited Matthew, you know, the road to heaven is a very narrow. So I don't think he's trying to score points at the expense of Judaism or to distance himself from Judaism. No. But he wants to show that, look, we have access to this fabulous treasure. And only a few years before the presumed date of this homily, Christians were debarred from teaching in higher institutions of learning. So he's trying to say, look, we have a claim to this beautiful tradition and we are competent in it. And in fact, it is psychophiles, it's soul enhancing. That is his point. So Basil himself, remember, this is a very refined gentleman who has had a superb education, the best education available in Antioch and in Constantinople under Libanius, a brilliant orator. So he wants to push for the pagan tradition, but he's not really trying to say, stay away from Judaism. No, I really don't think so. In fact, the temptation would have been great to distance himself from the Christians, from the pagans, because they were so near in time, weren't they, to his society. So no, I don't think so. But that is a tortured question, the early Christians and the Jews. But he is an extraordinary thinker, at least a liberal-minded reader of the pagan classics. And had it not been for these 3 or 4 gentlemen thinkers, I do think that many early Christians would have turned into Talibans and started burning manuscripts, Homeric manuscripts. And,
Mais alguma pergunta?
Imagino que o trabalho tenha sido feito em 2 momentos distintos no seu trabalho. Primeiro sobre São Basílio e depois o encontro com os azulejos. É isso? E eu gostaria de saber um pouco desse envolvimento com os azulejos, como foi esse percurso e como esse encontro ecoou no seu pensamento.
Eu vi as sentenças no claustro e como classicista imediatamente reagi realizando que oh, I'm sorry. But maybe I should just say it in English. But I realized that, gosh, this is Horace. This is Horace disfarçado, or Cicero. And of course, I knew that the padres, the fathers, were trained in Latin, of course. But what would reading Horace, how would that help them spiritually? And so I went to Basil to see what is the position of the church, the early church, and remember that Basil was adopted by and accepted wholeheartedly by the Roman Catholic Church. So these padres had access in some way to Basil, I think. So I wanted to see why. Of course, a lot has happened between Basil and the Padres, and you have the Jesuits. But I really think that the rediscovery of Basil in around 1400, when Bruni translated him into Latin, I do think that had an effect on the Catholic world as a whole. I really think so. Don't forget that Bruni was one of the leading figures of early humanist thinking, and he translated Aristotle, Cicero. So all this must have percolated down, filtered through, and I dare say it would have reached Bahia in some way. Let's call it a perverse way.
Mais alguma pergunta? I find it interesting that Basil sees Odysseus as a paragon of virtue, of Christian virtue, because of course he's a paragon of Greek virtue. But then when you think of Odysseus from the mythology, he's the opposite. He's, he's the opposite of a virtuous, a Christian virtuous man. So it's interesting that Basil is digesting Greek mythology and transforming this into something else that at the same time suits him and what he wants to do, and also assures the survival of the Greek classical tradition. So it's very interesting. And in Bahia, the priests are doing the same, maybe unconsciously. So you have this resonance in Brazil, and of course, maybe many people who visit the site probably don't recognize the associations, the links between Horus and then. And it's waiting there to find someone like you to make these connections, and then everything comes alive again, and all the tradition links itself with full strength. So it's interesting that ancient Greek culture survives the way it finds paths to survive. It's almost like a living thing. So that is the most interesting thing that I could see in your that draw my attention. So thank you very much for this.
Pervivência.
Pervivência, exactly.
Yes, that is pervivência.
It's so interesting to know such connections. I don't know the cloisters. But anyway,
You must give.
Your exposition remembered me that a principle of Catholic anthropology, and this is already a concept in the 20th century, but such an idea that all human manifestations are God's manifestations. So you can find in all the cultures traces of Christian morality. And this is a very smart strategy for evangelical domination, I would say. And we have many people in Brazil who criticizes such a theological idea because it can be a kind of justification of, for example, for to evangelize Indians and so on. But anyway, it's this idea is probably in the background of such appropriations in every kind of culture, and especially in the magnificent ancient world. You can find the truth and the Christian truth, not that one of the pagans and so on. So I guess this is the theological idea that justifies such an appropriation. And I just would like to know if this is proper for such a situation. To ask you personally, as a man who comes from an Orthodox context, how do you feel about this idea, which is very Catholic, universal, and very typical of the Roman Church? What do you think about this idea? And if you could explain a bit your surprise in seeing that being a man from the Orthodox context.
Well, I'm not surprised at all. I mean, I'm not surprised. I'm certainly pleased, like all of you, that Basil took a very soft line towards Homer and other, the whole of pagan literature. But what strikes me is, well, let's say that I come from an Orthodox background, is that Basil sees to syngenes, which in Greek means that which is cognate, which is related to us, you see. Congenital, you might say. That is beautiful. I find that we are syngenes. We come from the same genos as human beings, and he does try to foreignize them, the pagans, or turn them into something exotic. But he says, look, they're different from us, but they have something which is oikeon, and they're very near to our home, you might say. You see, oikos, oikeon, very familiar. So as Orthodox, I appreciate that point, that we have this, even amongst Christians, we have this oikeotes, this affinity. But the bad thing about Christianity and any other monolithic religion is that one believes that he or she is in control or has access to the truth. And he says, well, we are syngenes, we are oikoioi, but they believe in something, they preach something which is close to the truth, but we have the truth, you see. That's the bottom line. We have the truth. So go along with your pagan neighbors, read their books, study their books, even imitate their literary style, but only insofar as all this is compatible with your tenets, our tenets, sorry. So that is what I don't like, you see.
Eu agradeço então mais uma vez o professor Ioannis Petropoulos. Σας ευχαριστώ πολύ για τη διάλεξη.
Ευχαριστώ. And read Cavafy's Odyssey, the poem on the return of Odysseus. What is the name of the poem? I forgot.
Ithaca.
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 I should have known that. Ithaki. Read that. That's allegorical.
Yes.
But from a secular point of view.
Yes. You remind me of Cavafis. I was going to tell you that.
Yes, oh.
Yeah.
It's been translated into Portuguese, I'm sure.
Yes, by Isis Borges, yes. And Trajano has some translations from Cavafis. Trajano tem algumas traduções do Cavafis. Professor Trajano da Unicamp. Então, vamos fazer uma pausa agora de 15 minutos para o coffee break e depois retornamos. Breakfast.
Espero que não.